My name is Kara Aguilar. I am 32 years old. 2 weeks ago, I sat in a private dining room in Bismarck, North Dakota, surrounded by 20 relatives for my grandmother's 80th birthday. I watched my father stand up, tap his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon, and announce to the entire room that I had never lifted a single finger for our family. My mother nodded in solemn agreement, reaching up to adjust her designer silk scarf like she was attending a funeral. Across the table, my older brother Wyatt smirked. He leaned back in his tufted leather chair, making sure the ambient light caught the heavy gold band of his $15,000 Rolex. The room went dead silent. Uncles, aunts, and cousins shifted in their seats, waiting for me to shrink, to offer a trembling apology, to fold into myself the way they had conditioned me to do for my entire life. I did not say a word. Instead, the woman sitting to my right, my 80-year-old Grandma Inez, reached into her worn leather tote bag. She pulled out a heavy green agricultural ledger and dropped it onto the mahogany table with a dull thud. What she read out loud over the next 3 minutes made my father choke on his own breath, wiped the smug grin right off my brother's face, and revealed exactly who had been funding their perfect illusion for the last 10 years. Before I tell you exactly what was in that book, please take a second to hit like and subscribe. Welcome to Jessica Told Stories. I would love to know your age and where you are listening from, so drop that in the comments below. Now let me take you back to how this all started and why I let them dig their own graves. To understand the silence at that dinner table, you have to understand the ice. 10 years ago, I was 22 years old and living in the Bakken oil fields of western North Dakota. I worked 70-hour weeks as a logistics dispatcher for a heavy machinery firm in Williston. The winters out there do not just make you shiver. The cold cracks engine blocks. It freezes the moisture in your lungs. I lived in a single-wide trailer that constantly smelled of stale coffee and diesel exhaust. Frost crawled up the inside of my thin windows every night. I wore 2 pairs of thermal socks to bed, ate cheap canned soup, and saved every single penny I earned. Hazard pay in the oil fields was exceptional, and I treated my savings account like a fortress. 3 hours east, my parents lived in a sprawling, pristine farmhouse on the edge of Bismarck. They hosted summer barbecues, attended country club luncheons, and maintained an image of effortless rural wealth. Then came the phone call in late November. I was sitting at my dispatch desk at 2 a.m. The radio crackled with static from the rigs, and my hands were wrapped around a ceramic mug just to keep my fingers functional. My phone buzzed. It was my mother, Diane. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I was staying warm. She just started sobbing. The pitch of her voice was high, frantic, and calculated. She told me my father's agricultural supply business was failing. They were drowning in secret debt, and the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Bismarck house. They had exactly 10 days to produce $40,000, or the bank would take the property. My mother wept through the receiver, telling me that if they lost the house, they would lose their standing at the church. They would have to resign from the country club. The shame would destroy my father. She begged me to wire my savings to their joint account. She promised it was a temporary setback. She promised my father would pay me back by spring. I sat in the dim light of the dispatch center, looking down at my scuffed, steel-toed work boots. I listened to my mother cry over golf course memberships while I was currently rationing propane to keep my trailer above freezing. A memory surfaced in my mind. Years ago, during a whiteout blizzard, my grandfather sat with me at his kitchen table, teaching me how to balance the farm accounts. He tapped his thick finger against a column of numbers and said, "Numbers do not lie, Kara. People do." I told my mother I would handle it. I hung up the phone. I did not wire them a single dollar. The next morning, after a 14-hour shift, I drove straight to a commercial law office in downtown Williston. The waiting room smelled of lemon polish and old paper. I sat across from a sharp estate attorney and handed him a cashier's check containing nearly every dollar I had earned in the frozen mud of the Bakken fields. I did not give my parents the money. I had the attorney contact their bank. I legally purchased their distressed debt. I became their silent lien holder. The bank processed the paperwork and sent my father a formal, highly confusing corporate letter stating his late penalties and arrears had been restructured and satisfied by a third-party holding entity. My parents did not read the fine print. They assumed it was a bureaucratic miracle. They assumed the bank had simply realized they were upstanding citizens and granted them a quiet pardon. Their gratitude for my supposed help lasted exactly 1 week. Thanksgiving arrived. I drove 3 hours through the snow to sit at their dining room table. The house smelled of roasted sage and expensive wine. My father sat at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, carving a turkey while holding court with our relatives. I took a sip of tap water and listened to him brag. He told my uncle that the economy was tough, but smart financial maneuvering and true business grit had kept their household thriving. He tapped his temple, smiling, taking full credit for saving the house. My mother chimed in, praising his sharp intellect. Wyatt, who was currently living rent-free in a Fargo apartment funded by my parents, nodded eagerly and asked for a second slice of pie. No one looked at me. No one thanked me. I sat there in a sweater I bought on clearance, eating dry turkey, looking at the vaulted ceiling of a house that I literally owned. I held the paper to their entire lives, and they treated me like a ghost. I did not expose them that night. I just smiled, swallowed my food, and watched them perform. I realized then that my family did not want a daughter. They wanted a safety net they could step on without looking down. And so, the silent rebellion began. The reality of the Bakken oil fields is not something you can easily explain to people who spend their Sunday mornings deciding which country club brunch to attend. Williston, North Dakota, during the height of the boom, was a frozen, chaotic expanse of mud, steel, and exhaust. I was 22 years old, working 70-hour weeks as a logistics dispatcher for a heavy machinery firm. My days consisted of managing frustrated truck drivers, coordinating rig deliveries in sub-zero temperatures, and staring at dual monitors until my vision blurred. The hazard pay was undeniable, but it demanded every ounce of your physical and mental endurance. I lived in a freezing single-wide trailer where the heater rattled louder than a freight train and the windows grew thick layers of frost on the inside. I ate cheap canned chili, wore 3 layers of thermal clothing to sleep, and saved every single penny I earned. I treated my savings account like a fortress. 3 hours east, my parents lived in a sprawling, pristine farmhouse on the edge of Bismarck. They hosted elegant summer barbecues, attended charity luncheons, and maintained an image of effortless rural wealth. That image was their entire identity. When my mother called me that November, sobbing frantically through the phone, she did not ask how I was coping with the minus 40-degree wind chill. She did not ask if I was getting enough sleep. She simply demanded salvation. My father's agricultural supply business was failing. They had hidden the debt for months, and now the bank was formally foreclosing on their pristine home. They needed $40,000 immediately. My mother wept, detailing how losing the house meant losing their standing in the community, the church, and the local elite circles. The shame, she insisted, would destroy my father. I sat in the dim blue light of my dispatch trailer, listening to her cry over golf course memberships while I was rationing propane just to keep my fingers nimble enough to type. A vivid memory surfaced in my mind. Years prior, during a harsh whiteout blizzard, my grandfather had sat with me at his kitchen table, teaching me how to balance the farm accounts. He tapped his weathered finger against a column of numbers and said, "Numbers do not lie, Kara. People do." I told my mother I would handle it. I hung up the phone. I did not wire them a single dollar. The next morning, functioning on 3 hours of sleep, I drove straight to a commercial law office in downtown Williston. The waiting room smelled of lemon polish and old leather. I sat across from a sharp estate attorney and handed him a cashier's check containing nearly every dollar I had painstakingly earned in the frozen mud of the Bakken fields. I instructed the attorney to contact their bank. I legally purchased their distressed debt. I became their silent lien holder. The bank processed the paperwork and sent my father a formal, highly confusing corporate letter stating his late penalties and arrears had been restructured and satisfied by a third-party holding entity. My parents did not read the fine print. They assumed it was a bureaucratic miracle. They assumed the bank had simply realized they were upstanding citizens and granted them a quiet pardon due to their inherent prestige. Their gratitude for my supposed financial assistance lasted exactly 1 week. Thanksgiving arrived shortly after. I drove 3 hours through a driving snowstorm to sit at their dining room table. The house smelled of roasted sage, expensive wine, and unearned security. My father sat at the head of the long table, his chest puffed out, carving a turkey while holding court with our extended relatives. I took a sip of tap water and listened to him brag. He told my uncle that the economy was tough, but smart financial maneuvering and true business grit had kept their household thriving. He tapped his temple, smiling, taking full credit for saving the house. A lesser man would have folded under the pressure. My father proclaimed, his voice booming across the room, "But the Aguilar spirit is about resilience. We weather the storm." My mother chimed in, adjusting her pearls, praising his sharp intellect and steady hand. I sat there in a sweater I had bought on clearance, eating dry turkey, looking up at the vaulted ceiling of a house that I legally owned. I held the paper to their entire lives, yet they treated me like a ghost. I did not expose them that night. I just smiled, swallowed my food, and watched them perform. I realized then that my family did not want a daughter. They wanted a safety net they could step on without looking down. While I was dispatching oil rigs at 3 a.m, my older brother Wyatt was playing pretend. He had recently moved to Fargo to become a luxury real estate developer. In reality, he was living entirely off high-interest credit cards, leasing expensive cars he could not afford, and talking in circles about synergy and market disruption. My parents worshipped him. To them, Wyatt was a genius entrepreneur, the true pride of the Aguilar family. He arrived late to that Thanksgiving dinner, smelling of expensive cologne and complaining about the drive in his brand new SUV. Every holiday dinner was a tribute to his non-existent empire, while I was dismissed with a wave of the hand as the girl who answers phones for the oil boys out west. The true sting of betrayal arrived 6 months later during the messy, muddy spring thaw in the Bakken. I had kept access to a shared family banking portal originally set up years ago for emergencies, just to monitor if my parents were falling behind again. One Tuesday evening, after a grueling shift, I logged in. A fresh charge glared back at me from the screen. $15,000 paid to a luxury jeweler in Fargo. My parents had not been starving. They had not been restructuring their business. They were subsidizing my brother's delusions of grandeur. I cross-referenced the charge with Wyatt's social media. There it was, a fresh photo of his wrist resting on the steering wheel of his SUV, the heavy gold band of a new Rolex catching the sunlight. Caption: closing deals. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. I picked up my phone and dialed my father. He answered with his usual jovial tone, assuming I was calling to check in. I cut straight to the point. I asked him why $15,000 was just spent on a watch, while 6 months ago they were weeping over a foreclosure. The shift in his voice was instantaneous. The jovial tone vanished, replaced by a fierce, defensive hostility. "You do not question my financial decisions under my roof," he snapped the words, biting through the receiver. "You were going to lose that roof 6 months ago," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. My father exploded. "Family supports family, Kara. Your brother is building a brand. He needs to project success to attract investors. You have oil money you sit up there hoarding your paychecks, but your brother has a vision. You lack ambition, so do not dare question the people who actually take risks. He is the future of this family." He hung up on me. The line went dead, leaving only the sound of static echoing in my tiny trailer. I did not call him back. I did not argue. Arguing with them was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Instead, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. I printed the bank transfer receipt for the Rolex. I printed the original foreclosure notices. I printed the legal documents from my attorney proving I owned their debt. I slid all the papers into the folder and locked the drawer. They thought I was foolish. They thought I was compliant. They thought they could drain my resources and insult my intelligence without any consequences. They had no idea I was meticulously tracking every single dollar. I kept the receipts for the watch, the car payments, and the insurance premiums that followed over the next few years. I realized I could not fight them with words, so I decided to fight them with math. But I was not the only one keeping a silent tally. I just did not know it yet. A few weeks later, I drove out to a 200-acre farm outside Minot to check on my grandmother. What I found waiting for me on her heavy oak desk would change the trajectory of my entire life and forge an alliance my parents would never see coming. Fargo is a city desperately trying to outgrow its prairie roots, filled with renovated downtown lofts and overpriced espresso bars. Wyatt moved there right after failing out of a mediocre business program at a state college. He immediately rebranded himself as a luxury real estate developer. He leased a penthouse apartment featuring exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows. He drove a blacked-out luxury sports utility vehicle he could not afford to fuel. He printed business cards on thick matte paper with a sleek minimalist logo. His entire days consisted of scheduling power lunches, pitching conceptual commercial spaces to local investors who were far too polite to tell him his profit margins made 0 cents. He lived on credit. High-interest, unforgiving credit cards funded a lifestyle built entirely on smoke and mirrors. To my parents, Wyatt was a visionary. They actually framed his conceptual blueprints in the hallway of their Bismarck home, right next to his high school participation trophies. Every holiday dinner transformed into a tribute to his non-existent empire. He would sit at the head of the table, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, using words like synergy, market disruption, and passive income streams. My parents hung on to his every word. My mother would touch his arm and tell the room how proud she was of her ambitious son. Meanwhile, I was relegated to the end of the table. When guests asked about my life, my father would wave his hand dismissively. He would tell them, "Kara just answers phones for the oil boys out west." My reality was the Williston Basin. Dispatching rigs in the dead of night requires a level of mental endurance Wyatt could never comprehend. While he was sleeping off expensive bar tabs in downtown Fargo, I was coordinating emergency deliveries of drill bits in sub-zero wind chills. I breathed in diesel fumes and stale coffee. I scrubbed crude oil out from under my fingernails. I earned every single dollar through sheer physical and psychological stamina. I lived in a freezing trailer because I wanted financial freedom, not the illusion of it. I wanted security, something my parents clearly did not understand. The first true sting of betrayal arrived exactly 6 months after I quietly saved their house from foreclosure. Springtime in North Dakota turns the frozen plains into a sprawling ocean of thick brown mud. I had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift. My boots were caked in clay. I sat down at my small desk and booted up my laptop. I had retained access to a shared family credit account. I originally set it up during my college years to help them pay a utility bill, but I kept the login active to monitor their recovery. I wanted to make sure they were buying groceries. I wanted to ensure the lights stayed on in the house I had just rescued from the bank. The screen loaded. I expected to see standard charges for the local supermarket or a gas station. Instead, a specific line item glared at me from the digital statement. $15,000. The vendor was a premier jeweler located in downtown Fargo. My heart did not race. It just went incredibly cold. I picked up my phone and opened Wyatt's social media profile. There was a fresh photo posted just 3 hours prior. The image showed his wrist resting casually on the leather steering wheel of his leased vehicle. A heavy gold watch caught the afternoon sunlight. The caption read, "Closing big deals today." My parents had not been starving. They had not been diligently rebuilding their failed agricultural supply business. They were actively subsidizing his delusions of grandeur with money they did not have. I dialed my father. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. He sounded jovial, asking about the weather in the oil fields. I did not engage in small talk. I asked him point blank why $15,000 was just spent on a watch, while 6 months ago he and my mother were weeping over a bank foreclosure. The shift in his tone was instantaneous. The warm, fatherly facade vanished, replaced by a fierce, defensive hostility. "You do not question my financial decisions," he snapped, his voice echoing through the receiver. I reminded him that he was going to lose his roof just half a year prior, and that luxury jewelry was not a survival expense. My father exploded. "Family supports family, Kara. Your brother is building a brand. He needs to project success to attract real investors. You sit up there hoarding your oil paychecks, refusing to help your own blood, but your brother has a vision. You lack ambition, so do not dare question the people who actually take risks. He is the future of this family." He hung up the phone. The dial tone buzzed in my ear. A weaker person might have cried. A more impulsive person might have called back and screamed about owning their debt. I did neither. I realized in that exact moment that reasoning with delusion is a profound waste of energy. My father truly believed that buying a fake billionaire lifestyle for his son was a sound investment while treating his hardworking daughter like an automated teller machine was his divine right. I put my phone down. I opened a fresh browser tab and started digging deeper into the shared accounts. I spent the next 4 hours printing every single statement. I found the car payments. $600 a month for Wyatt's luxury vehicle, drafted directly from my parents' checking account. I found the premium auto insurance drafts. I found the extravagant dinners at steakhouses in Fargo. I found charges for designer suits, premium golf club memberships, and flights to networking events that produced zero revenue. I turned on my cheap inkjet printer and let it run until it ran out of paper. I took the stack of warm, freshly printed papers and placed them inside a thick manila folder. I bought a secure, fireproof filing cabinet for my trailer the very next day. Every time a new statement generated, I printed the receipts for the watch, the car payments, and the insurance premiums. I cataloged every cent they funneled into Wyatt's fake empire. I built a physical paper trail of their staggering financial negligence. They thought I was foolish. They thought my silence during those holiday dinners meant I was compliant and defeated. They had no idea I was meticulously tracking their ruin. I held the legal paperwork to their house, and now I held the documented proof of their irresponsible spending. Every receipt was a brick in a wall I was building around them. They were happily painting the inside of their own cage, believing they were untouchable. But carrying this secret alone was a heavy burden. I needed to know if the rot extended further down the family tree. I needed to check on the one person in our bloodline who actually understood the value of a hard-earned dollar. Grandma Inez lived alone on a vast property outside Minot. If my parents were willing to risk their own home to fund Wyatt, I knew they would eventually set their sights on her land. I packed my truck, drove out to her farm, and discovered a secret that would bind my grandmother and me together in a war they would never see coming. The drive from the Williston Basin to the rural outskirts of Minot takes you through an endless expanse of flat, unforgiving terrain. In the dead of winter, the North Dakota plains look like the surface of a frozen moon. The wind screams across the highway, kicking up drifts of white powder that blind your windshield. I made that drive on my only day off, my truck tires crunching over the packed ice. I needed to escape the claustrophobic walls of my dispatch trailer, and I needed to check on the only person in my family who possessed a spine. Grandma Inez lived on a sprawling 200-acre farm. She managed the land herself after my grandfather passed away, refusing to sell to corporate conglomerates, refusing to relocate to a comfortable retirement community. She was 80 years old, yet her posture remained straight as a fence post. Her primary crop was winter wheat. If you do not understand agriculture, a field of winter wheat in February looks like a desolate, barren wasteland. The seeds are planted in the autumn. They sprout briefly before the brutal frost arrives, burying the fragile green shoots under a foot of solid ice. To an untrained observer, the crop appears dead, suffocated by the freezing temperatures. But the truth is hidden beneath the surface. Under the frozen soil, the plant is quietly growing an immense, unbreakable root system. It anchors itself deep into the dark earth, hoarding nutrients, fortifying its base, while the rest of the world ignores it. When the spring thaw finally breaks the ice, that wheat erupts from the ground, tough and unyielding, ready to dominate the landscape. I stood at the edge of her frozen fields, looking out at the endless white expanse, and realized I was doing the exact same thing. I was burying my roots, anchoring myself in silence, building a foundation of undeniable proof, while my parents assumed I was just a dormant, foolish girl. The temperature inside the old timber barn was 10 degrees below zero. I could see every breath I took suspended in the frigid air. A vital copper water pipe leading to the livestock troughs had frozen and burst during the night. My father and my brother were only 3 hours away, but they were far too busy attending a weekend mixer at the Bismarck Country Club to drive out and help an elderly woman perform manual labor. So I was the one kneeling in the frozen dirt, my knuckles scraped and bleeding as I forced a heavy steel wrench around the stubborn fitting. The smell of rust, damp hay, and freezing metal filled my lungs. Footsteps crunched against the hardened earth behind me. I turned to see Inez standing in the barn doorway. She wore a thick canvas coat, her silver hair pulled back into a tight braid. Her weathered hands held a dented steel thermos. She walked over, knelt beside me in the dirt, and unscrewed the cup. She poured the steaming black coffee and handed it to me. The heat radiated through my insulated gloves, sending a painful welcome burn down my throat. She did not ask if I was tired. She did not offer empty sympathy. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her canvas coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I set the wrench down, taking the paper from her hand. It was a printed bank statement. The logo at the top belonged to my parents' primary financial institution. I looked up at her, My brow furrowed in confusion. Inez kept her eyes locked on mine. Her gaze was sharp, calculating, piercing through the freezing air. She explained that she had driven to Bismarck earlier that week to drop off a box of old family photographs. Martin had carelessly left his financial documents splayed open on his mahogany home office desk. He assumed his elderly mother was just a fragile widow who only understood knitting patterns and baking recipes. He severely underestimated the intellect of a woman who had successfully balanced complex agricultural spreadsheets through 3 separate economic recessions. Inez had scanned the document. She noticed the sudden disappearance of the crushing mortgage arrears. She noticed the incoming wire transfers. She noticed the glaring $15,000 debit to a Fargo jeweler. "They are bleeding you dry, Kara," she said quietly. Her voice did not shake. It carried a razor-sharp edge. "And they are doing it to feed Wyatt's ego." I stared at the crumpled bank statement, the cold sinking deeper into my bones. I wanted to defend them out of habit. I wanted to say it was a misunderstanding, that they had promised to repay me, that my father was just under a lot of pressure. But looking into Inez's unwavering eyes, the excuses caught in my throat. I could not lie to the woman who taught me how to read a balance sheet. I confessed everything. I told her about the panicked late-night phone call, the foreclosure threat, the secret lien I purchased, and the sickening realization that they were funneling their remaining funds into Wyatt's fake luxury lifestyle. Inez did not express shock. She simply nodded, her jaw set in a tight, grim line. She stood up, brushing the frozen dirt from her knees. She told me to finish tightening the pipe fitting and then come inside the house. 10 minutes later, I walked into her farmhouse kitchen. The cast-iron wood stove radiated an intense, comforting heat, smelling of burning oak and dry cedar. Inez was sitting at her heavy oak desk in the corner of the living room. The desk was meticulously organized, a testament to her disciplined mind. She unlocked the bottom drawer with a small brass key. She reached inside and pulled out a large, heavy book. It was a traditional agricultural ledger. The cover was bound in thick, green fabric frayed at the corners from decades of use. The pages inside were crisp-lined and waiting for data. This was a type of book farmers used to track crop yields, seed costs, and survival. She opened to a fresh section near the back, flattening the deep crease with her calloused thumb. She picked up a fountain pen and looked across the room at me. "We are keeping the score," she promised me. She smoothed the green cover of the book, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the wood stove. "Because one day, Kara, they will try to erase you. They will rewrite history to make themselves the heroes, and they will cast you as the villain. They will tell the entire world that you are a selfish, ungrateful child who never contributed a single thing to their legacy. When that day comes, we will not fight them with our feelings. We will fight them with ink." The arrangement was forged right there in the quiet warmth of the farmhouse. I agreed to send her a copy of every single receipt, every transfer confirmation, every utility bill I quietly covered to keep their facade from crumbling. The post office in Williston became my second home. Every 2 weeks, a plain white envelope traveled from the oil fields to the Minot farm. Inside, I placed the documented proof of my parents' staggering financial negligence. I sent the proof of Wyatt's car lease payments, drafted from the account I replenished. I sent the proof of the country club dues they charged to the emergency card. Inez received every envelope. She would sit at her oak desk in the evening, adjust her reading glasses, and open the green ledger. She wrote the date, the exact dollar amount, the purpose of the transaction, and the payee in flawless looping cursive. She treated my silent bailouts with the same precision she treated a harvest yield. This routine became our shared armor. The green book grew thicker, transforming from a simple ledger into a vault of undeniable truth. It provided me with a profound psychological comfort. I could endure the grueling shifts in the oil fields. I could sit through the agonizing Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, playing the part of the quiet, unaccomplished daughter. I could endure my father's condescending speeches and my brother's obnoxious boasting. Every time my father insulted my career or praised Wyatt's fictitious brilliance, I would glance across the dining table at Inez. A silent communication would pass between us. We knew the precise dollar amount it cost to keep his mahogany roof over his head. We knew exactly who was paying the electric bill, powering the chandelier shining down on Wyatt's luxury watch. We thought we had contained the damage. We thought meticulously tracking the financial drain was enough to protect ourselves until Wyatt inevitably crashed and burned. We assumed my brother's destructive tendencies were strictly limited to leasing designer clothes and buying premium golf clubs. We severely underestimated his sheer desperation to look important in front of other people. The quiet accumulation of receipts was about to prove insufficient. Wyatt's reckless behavior was preparing to cross the line from a financial annoyance into a physical catastrophe. Harvest season was fast approaching on the North Dakota plains, and my brother was desperately searching for a new prop to impress a group of phantom investors. Rather than renting equipment or admitting his limitations, he set his sights on the most expensive piece of heavy machinery sitting on Inez's property. The financial bleeding was about to escalate into raw destruction, and my parents were ready to demand that I pay the price for his arrogance. Harvest season on the North Dakota plains is not a casual event. It is a grueling, time-sensitive window where an entire year of labor hinges on a few crucial weeks of clear weather. The winter wheat my grandmother cultivated had to be pulled from the earth before the autumn frost hardened the ground. Her survival depended entirely on a single piece of heavy machinery. The John Deere combine she owned was a highly engineered, delicate piece of equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It required an experienced operator who understood the turning radius, the header height, and the terrain. It was the lifeblood of her operation. My brother viewed it as a prop. 3 years ago, Wyatt reached a new level of desperation. His phantom real estate firm in Fargo was failing to attract legitimate capital. Actual investors were asking for tangible assets, seeking proof that he possessed genuine agricultural business acumen. Rather than building a viable business plan, Wyatt decided to manufacture an illusion. He hired a freelance drone videographer and drove out to Inez's farm on a bright Tuesday afternoon. He wore a brand new flannel shirt with the tags freshly removed and pristine leather work boots that had never touched actual mud. He intended to film a promotional video featuring himself operating heavy agricultural equipment, aiming to project the image of a rugged, hands-on land developer. Inez was in town purchasing supplies. My father, Martin, had driven out to the farm to inspect a fence line. Instead of protecting his mother's livelihood, Martin handed the keys to his golden son. Driving a 50-ton combine is nothing like steering a luxury sports utility vehicle. It features rear-wheel steering and a massive front header designed to shave the earth. Wyatt climbed into the operator cabin, started the ignition, and signaled the drone pilot to begin recording. Within 4 minutes of engaging the throttle, Wyatt misjudged the slope of a steep drainage ditch bordering the southern wheat field. He drove the machine straight over the embankment. The front wheels slipped into the deep rut. The sheer weight of the combine forced the nose down, slamming the delicate header directly into the packed clay. A sickening crunch of twisting metal echoed across the empty fields. The primary axle snapped under the sudden immense torque. Hydraulic fluid bled into the dry dirt. Wyatt sat frozen in the cabin, having effectively destroyed the only tool capable of saving my grandmother's harvest. I was 3 hours away, sitting in the Williston Dispatch Center. The radio crackled with incoming coordinates from the oil rigs. The sharp scent of burnt coffee hovered in the air. My cell phone vibrated on the metal desk. The caller identification displayed my father's name. When I answered, Martin did not sound apologetic. He did not sound concerned for Inez. His voice vibrated with a panicked, irrational fury. He skipped the greeting entirely and launched into a tirade. "We have a disaster down here," he shouted, the sound of the harsh prairie wind whipping through the receiver. "Your brother had a minor mishap with the harvester. The local repair shop is quoting us $22,450. They are refusing to order the parts without an upfront payment." I set my ceramic mug down. I asked him how a minor mishap results in a cracked primary axle. Martin ignored the question. He immediately deflected the blame, aiming his misplaced rage directly at me. "This is what happens when a family does not operate as a cohesive unit, Kara. If you were a supportive sister, you would have taken your day off to drive down here and assist him. You know he is under immense pressure to secure these new investors. You left him out here to manage this alone. I need you to pull the funds from your emergency savings and wire them to my account right now." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. The psychological manipulation was staggering. My father had bypassed his own mother's authority, allowed his incompetent son to destroy a vital piece of farm equipment, and was now actively screaming at me because I was not present to supervise a grown man who was currently playing dress-up for a camera. He truly believed his twisted logic. In his mind, Wyatt's reckless vanity was a bold business move, and my absence was a dereliction of family duty. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with his delusion. I asked for the name of the diesel mechanic who assessed the damage. Martin hesitated, his tone shifting into suspicion. "Why do you need his name? Just send the transfer to my primary checking account. I will handle the logistics." I knew exactly what would happen if I wired the cash to my father. He would pay a fraction of it to patch the combine temporarily, and he would divert the rest of my hard-earned money to cover whatever hidden debts Wyatt had accrued that month. Inez would be left with a failing machine halfway through her harvest. "Give me the name of the mechanic," I repeated, my voice dropping to a flat, unyielding register. "Or you can figure out how to harvest 200 acres of wheat with your bare hands." He gritted his teeth and spat out the name of a local heavy equipment repair shop in Minot. I hung up the phone. I did not pay that bill to save Wyatt from the consequences of his arrogance. I paid it solely to protect Inez. I called the repair shop directly. A gruff diesel technician answered, confirming the catastrophic damage to the axle and the header. I gave him my corporate card number over the phone, authorizing the full $22,450. I gave him strict instructions that the payment was on behalf of Inez Aguilar, and that neither Martin nor Wyatt were permitted to authorize any further work or touch the machine once the repairs were completed. I cut my parents out of the transaction entirely. The mechanic dispatched a heavy tow rig to pull the combine out of the ditch. Inez was able to salvage her harvest, bringing in her crop just 2 days before the first major frost hit the region. My mother, Diane, went to work immediately. A failure of that magnitude in a small rural community generates gossip faster than a wildfire. Diane could not allow her country club friends to whisper about Wyatt's incompetence. She spent the next 2 weeks twisting the narrative with breathtaking audacity. While buying imported cheeses at the local grocer, I heard she told the mayor's wife a fascinating tale. According to Diane, Wyatt was graciously inspecting the farm equipment for his elderly grandmother when he detected a severe mechanical flaw in the steering column. He heroically steered the massive machine into a ditch to prevent it from rolling into the main roadway and causing a fatal accident. My mother spun a catastrophic failure into an act of selfless bravery. Wyatt did not correct the story. He wore the unearned praise like a badge of honor, soaking up the admiration of their elite social circle. I visited the farm the following Sunday. The air was turning bitter, hinting at the long winter ahead. I walked into the farmhouse kitchen. Inez was waiting for me. She did not say a word about the accident. She simply unlocked the bottom drawer of her heavy oak desk and pulled out the frayed green ledger. She opened the book to the latest page. She picked up a fountain pen filled with bright red ink. She wrote the date. She wrote the name of the repair shop. Then, in flawless cursive, she wrote the exact amount. $22,450. She underlined the number twice. The red ink bled slightly into the thick paper, looking like a fresh wound on the page. We let them keep their fiction. We let Wyatt strut around Fargo boasting about his agricultural prowess. We let my parents revel in their manufactured prestige. We knew the truth was locked safely in that drawer, but the financial bleeding was about to stop being a mere annoyance. The global oil markets were preparing for a sudden shift, and my firm was ready to offer me a promotion that would quietly increase my wealth. Meanwhile, Wyatt's house of cards was finally running out of credit limits. His phantom investors were demanding returns, and the local banks were preparing to seize his leased assets. The minor repairs and luxury watches were no longer enough to plug the holes in his sinking ship. My parents were going to need a monumental amount of cash to save him, and to get it, they would set their sights on the very soil beneath my grandmother's feet. I needed to test their desperation, and I knew exactly what kind of bait to use. A year and a half ago, the rhythm of the global energy sector changed. The frantic wildcat energy of the Bakken Formation stabilized into a cold, calculated industrial machine. Corporate consolidation swept through the North Dakota plains. Companies absorbed their weaker competitors, streamlining operations and rewarding the few people who actually understood the complex logistics of moving heavy steel across frozen earth. My firm recognized the hours I had banked, the crises I had averted, and the relentless efficiency I brought to their supply chain. They promoted me to regional director. I traded the drafty diesel-scented trailer for a climate-controlled office featuring glass walls and digital mapping screens. My salary tripled, accompanied by executive stock options and a comprehensive benefits package. I was quietly generating a very comfortable living, securing my future with ironclad investments. Yet outside those glass office walls, I changed nothing about my appearance. I continued driving the same reliable, weather-beaten truck. I wore the same faded denim and practical winter coats. I maintained a deliberate, stealthy existence, staying entirely off my family's radar. To them, I was still the invisible dispatcher scraping by on hourly wages. While my career anchored itself into solid bedrock, Wyatt's precarious house of cards began to sway in the wind. The Fargo real estate market experienced a sudden, sharp tightening. Lending standards grew strict. Financial institutions stopped handing out commercial capital based on firm handshakes and hollow buzzwords. Wyatt could no longer refinance his existing debts to cover his exorbitant living expenses. Creditors began calling his cell phone, their tone shifting from polite inquiries to stern ultimatums. He defaulted on 3 separate high-interest loans in rapid succession. The leasing company managing his luxury sports utility vehicle sent final warning notices. His conceptual commercial projects evaporated, leaving him holding worthless blueprints and staggering liabilities. My parents sensed the impending ruin. Their entire social identity, their fragile standing at the Bismarck Country Club, and their manufactured prestige were inextricably tied to his fabricated success. If Wyatt fell, their reputation would shatter into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. They needed a monumental injection of cash to satisfy his lenders and save face. I knew they were desperate. I needed to gauge the exact depth of their panic, and more importantly, I needed to ensure they did not view me as a potential resource or a threat. I had to lower their guard. I decided to test the waters by offering them a carefully constructed red herring. On a quiet Tuesday evening, sitting behind the mahogany desk in my new corner office, I picked up my phone and dialed my brother. I waited for him to answer, taking a deep breath to manipulate my vocal cords. I forced my voice to tremble slightly, mimicking the anxious, exhausted tone of a person drowning in overdue bills. Wyatt answered with a terse, impatient greeting. The background noise suggested he was pacing across the hardwood floors of his penthouse. I swallowed hard, playing my part. "Wyatt, I need a favor," I said, keeping my volume low. "My rent check is going to bounce this month. The hours at the dispatch center were cut. I just need a $500 loan to cover the gap. I will pay you back as soon as my next paycheck clears." Silence stretched across the cellular connection. I waited, listening to his shallow breathing. I offered him a chance to show a fraction of human decency, a chance to remember the tens of thousands of dollars I had quietly funneled into his survival over the years. Wyatt did not offer empathy. He laughed. It was a cold, sharp, condescending sound that echoed through the receiver. The laughter contained zero warmth, only a cruel sense of superiority. He scoffed, the sound of ice clinking in a glass, translating his arrogant posture. $500, Kara. He repeated the amount like it was an insult to his ears. "You are calling a commercial developer for pocket change. This is exactly what happens when you settle for a blue-collar life. You lack vision. You refuse to take risks, and now you are begging your younger brother to keep a roof over your head. I am managing high-level asset restructuring right now. I do not have the liquid capital to sponsor your failures. Figure it out yourself. Try picking up a second shift." He terminated the call. I slowly lowered the phone, resting it on the polished surface of my desk. A genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. The trap had snapped shut perfectly. Wyatt's bloated ego blinded him to his own catastrophic reality. He was weeks away from public bankruptcy, yet he still derived immense pleasure from kicking his sister while he assumed she was down. The news of my fabricated poverty traveled fast. Within 2 days, my mother called me. Diane did not call to offer financial assistance or maternal comfort. She called to weaponize my fake vulnerability. I sat in my truck listening to her voice drip with practiced disappointment. "Wyatt told us about your little rent crisis," she began, sighing heavily into the microphone. "It breaks my heart to see you struggling, Kara. But your father and I always warned you about your lack of financial literacy. You never invested in yourself. You never studied portfolio management the way your brother did." The profound irony of her lecture hung in the cabin of my truck. Diane was lecturing the silent lien holder of her own estate on the principles of fiscal responsibility. She was quoting financial buzzwords she had misheard from a son who was currently dodging repo men. "We simply cannot bail you out," Diane continued, her tone shifting into a firm reprimand. "We are reallocating our own assets to assist Wyatt with a major upcoming expansion. You need to learn the consequences of poor planning. Use this as a learning opportunity." I kept my voice meek. I told her I understood, apologizing for burdening them with my trivial problems. Diane ended the call feeling victorious. I ended the call feeling invincible. The red herring executed its purpose flawlessly. My parents and my brother mentally discarded me. To them, I was a destitute, struggling dispatcher, incapable of covering a basic rent check. They crossed my name off their list of concerns. They lowered their defensive shields, utterly convinced I possessed zero resources, zero influence, and zero capacity to interfere with whatever frantic scheme they were brewing to save their golden boy. But beneath their smug exterior, the terror was consuming them. Wyatt's creditors were drawing up public lawsuits. The Bismarck elite would soon read about his defaults in the local public records. Martin and Diane required a massive sum of liquid cash far beyond the limits of their heavily leveraged credit cards. They needed hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they needed it before the end of the fiscal quarter. Since they believed their daughter was penniless, they turned their desperate sights away from the oil fields. They needed an unencumbered asset, a piece of high-value property that could be liquidated fast. They looked north. They locked their sights on a sprawling expanse of fertile soil outside Minot. They looked at the 200 acres of winter wheat cultivated by an 80-year-old widow. My father technically held a 50% legal stake in that land, a dormant inheritance left behind when my grandfather passed away. For decades, Martin had ignored the farm, viewing it as a rural relic beneath his sophisticated country club lifestyle. Now, it represented his only escape hatch. They decided the soil my grandmother had spent her entire life working was nothing more than a poker chip to pay off Wyatt's catastrophic gambling. They prepared to sell the farm right out from under her feet, confident that no one in the world had the financial ammunition to stop them. They were wrong, and I was about to find out exactly how far they were willing to go to destroy their own blood. The weekend arrived with a biting chill that swept down from the Canadian border. I drove my truck down the familiar gravel road leading to my grandmother's property. The stalks of dormant winter wheat stretched out in every direction, a vast ocean of frozen potential waiting beneath the snow crust. This land was a living, breathing entity to Inez. She knew the chemical composition of the dirt. She knew the exact angle of the sun hitting the eastern ridge in late November. The farm was her sanctuary, her legacy, and her physical anchor to the world. I parked near the weather-beaten timber barn and walked toward the farmhouse. The heavy wooden front door creaked open, greeting me with a wave of intense heat from the cast-iron stove. The scent of simmering chicken broth and dried sage filled the narrow hallway. Inez stood at the kitchen counter, carefully rolling out pie dough with a heavy wooden pin. Her silver braid rested over one shoulder, her hands moving with a rhythmic, practiced efficiency that only comes from 8 decades of relentless labor. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee from the percolator and leaned against the counter. We exchanged quiet pleasantries about the upcoming freeze and the state of the local roads. The kitchen felt safe. It felt removed from the suffocating vanity of my parents and the impending financial ruin of my brother. Then the answering machine clicked on. It sat on the edge of the oak desk in the living room, a dusty relic from a previous decade, featuring a tiny, blinking red light and a small speaker. A harsh electronic beep pierced the quiet warmth of the house. A man's voice filled the room. The tone was crisp, polished, and inherently corporate. It was the kind of voice that belonged in a boardroom, not a rural farmhouse. "Good afternoon," the voice announced, smooth and practiced. "This message is for Martin Aguilar. This is Marcus Vance with Prairie Basin Energy Development. I am calling to confirm the preliminary appraisal date you requested for the Minot acreage. Our geological team has reviewed the satellite topography, and our fracking subsidiary is highly interested in the subterranean potential of the property. Based on current market valuations, we are looking at an initial buyout figure hovering around $800,000 for the entire parcel. We need your signature along with the co-owner's consent to authorize the soil drilling test next Thursday. Please return my call at your earliest convenience." The machine beeped again. A mechanical click echoed as the tape stopped spinning. The silence that followed was suffocating. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. My hands were remarkably steady, but the blood roaring in my ears drowned out every other sound. I stared at the blinking red light on the answering machine, processing the staggering cruelty of the words hanging in the air. When my grandfather passed away 2 decades ago, He left the 200-acre farm divided in a legal trust. Inez retained a 50% stake and lifetime residency rights, while the other 50% transferred to his only son, Martin. For 20 years, my father treated that legal stake as a nuisance. He despised the dirt. He hated the rural aesthetic. He preferred manicured golf greens and country club dining rooms. He never once offered to pay a property tax bill, fix a broken fence, or help with the harvest. He left the back-breaking labor entirely to an aging widow. Now facing the collapse of Wyatt's fictitious real estate empire, Martin remembered his inheritance. My parents and my brother had concocted a scheme so predatory it defied basic human decency. They were plotting to force a legal sale of the entire property to a corporate energy developer. They intended to take their $400,000 share of the profits and funnel the cash directly to Wyatt, saving him from his angry creditors. The sheer scale of the devastation this plan required was breathtaking. A fracking subsidiary would not cultivate the land. They would strip it bare. They would roll in fleets of heavy diesel machinery, inject chemical solvents deep into the bedrock, and poison the soil forever. The winter wheat would never grow again. The legacy my grandfather built with his bare hands would be turned into an industrial wasteland, sacrificed to cover the unpaid credit card bills of a 32-year-old man who refused to get a real job. But the environmental destruction was only a fraction of the horror. To execute this sale, Martin and Diane would have to evict my grandmother. They expected an 80-year-old woman, a woman who had poured her sweat and tears into this very soil, to simply pack up her life into a few cardboard boxes. They expected her to abandon her home and relocate to a sterile, cheap assisted living facility in Bismarck. They were willing to strip her of her dignity, her independence, and her sanctuary, just to maintain the illusion that Wyatt was a successful businessman. A cold, sharp anger bloomed in my chest. It started in my ribs and spread outward, freezing the blood in my veins. This was not the familiar ache of parental neglect. This was not the dull sting of being passed over at the dinner table. This was a dark, unyielding rage. I thought about the 10 years I spent living in a freezing trailer. I thought about the grueling 70-hour shifts, the hazard pay I hoarded, and the staggering sacrifices I made to keep a roof over my parents' heads. I had silently funded their country club dues, bailed out their failing supply business, and covered the insurance on my brother's luxury vehicles. I asked for nothing in return. I absorbed their insults, played the role of the uneducated oil worker, and allowed them to mock my supposed poverty. Their repayment for a decade of my silent devotion was a calculated plot to render my grandmother homeless. I walked slowly from the kitchen into the living room, stopping in front of the heavy oak desk. The green agricultural ledger sat perfectly aligned near the edge of the wood, containing the precise ink-stained record of every dollar they had drained from me. I turned to look at Inez. She had not stopped rolling out the pie dough. Her movements remained steady, deliberate, and entirely unbothered. She did not look shocked. She did not look frightened by the prospect of losing her home. She sprinkled a handful of flour across the wooden cutting board, brushing the excess powder from her fingertips. "They are preparing to force a sale," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Martin is going to use his 50% stake to push you out and sell the acreage to an oil subsidiary. He wants the cash for Wyatt." Inez picked up a damp cloth and wiped her hands. She walked out of the kitchen, her boots clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She stopped beside me, staring down at the blinking red light of the answering machine. The orange glow from the wood stove cast deep shadows across her weathered face, highlighting the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. I felt the anger crystallize into a concrete, undeniable purpose. The years of hiding, the years of playing the compliant victim vanished in an instant. My parents had finally crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had mistaken my quiet endurance for weakness, and they were about to discover the catastrophic flaw in their logic. I looked at Inez across the scarred surface of the desk. "They aren't taking this farm," I said. Inez turned her head, meeting my gaze. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It was a sharp, dangerous look, containing generations of prairie resilience and a profound, chilling calculation. She reached out, resting her calloused hand gently on top of the green ledger. "I know," she replied. We did not need to discuss the logistics. We did not need to shed tears over the betrayal. The emotional severing was finished. We had the legal ammunition, the financial leverage, and the cold-blooded patience required to dismantle them piece by piece. But before I executed the trap that would strip my father of his power, I needed to look my mother in the eye one last time. I needed to give them a final opportunity to show a shred of humanity, knowing full well they would fail the test. The confrontation was set, and I was ready to walk straight into their pristine house to deliver the bait. The drive from Minot back to Bismarck provided ample time to process the sheer audacity of my parents' scheme. The highway stretched forward like a gray ribbon cutting through the frozen plains. I navigated the familiar route, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my mind operating with a cold, mechanical precision. I was about to enter the lion's den, but I no longer felt like prey. Arriving at my parents' pristine subdivision always felt like crossing into an alternate dimension. The neighborhood consisted of manicured lawns, oversized faux colonial facades, and wide driveways displaying leased European sedans. It was a monument to superficial wealth. My weathered truck stood out like a stray dog wandering into a ballroom. I parked by the curb, killed the engine, and stared at the heavy oak front door. Before I unleashed the legal trap Mr. Henderson and I were preparing, I needed to grant them one final opportunity. I needed to look my mother in the eye and give her a chance to express a shred of human decency. I did not expect her to take it. I just needed the closure of watching her reject it. I unlocked the front door using the spare key they forgot I possessed. The interior of the house smelled of vanilla diffusers and lemon polish. Every surface gleamed. My mother, Diane, operated this home as a stage set. Her entire existence revolved around securing her rank within the local country club hierarchy. She spent her days organizing charity luncheons she cared nothing about, purely to photograph well next to the wives of prominent local politicians. She required an immaculate backdrop to project her carefully curated narrative of success. I found her standing in the vast, marble-countered kitchen. She wore a crisp white blouse and tailored slacks, her hair perfectly coiffed. She was busy arranging a dozen imported lilies into a tall crystal vase. The flowers likely cost more than a week of groceries for a normal family. She snipped the stems with sharp silver shears, humming a tuneless melody, entirely untroubled by the fact that she was actively plotting to render her own mother-in-law homeless. She looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. The polite public smile she wore by default flickered onto her face, then quickly vanished, replaced by a tight expression of guarded irritation. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not offer a cup of coffee. She asked why I was tracking mud onto her clean hardwood floors. I looked down at my boots. They were perfectly dry. I looked back at her, studying the rigid posture and the defensive tilt of her chin. She sensed the shift in my demeanor. I was not the quiet, compliant daughter who usually absorbed her passive insults. I walked further into the room, stopping on the opposite side of the kitchen island. I watched her trim another green stem. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the incoming winter weather. "I visited Grandma Inez yesterday," I said, leaning forward slightly. "While I was there, a man from Prairie Basin Energy Development left a voicemail. He wanted to confirm the preliminary appraisal dates." The silver shears in Diane's hand stopped moving. Her knuckles whitened. She carefully set the tool down on the marble counter, taking a long, slow breath to compose her features. When she looked up, her eyes were hard, calculating, and devoid of any familial warmth. She did not feign ignorance. She did not panic. She simply pivoted to her practiced defense mechanism. "That is family business, Kara," she replied, her voice smooth and chillingly detached. "Wyatt is restructuring his assets, and your father is simply doing what a good patriarch does. He is securing the future of this family." The audacity of the statement hung in the air. Restructuring his assets. She used the corporate jargon Wyatt fed her, masking the ugly truth of his impending bankruptcy behind polite syllables. She was attempting to sanitize a brutal betrayal by wrapping it in the language of high finance. I maintained my steady gaze. I refused to let her hide behind polished vocabulary. "You are kicking an 80-year-old woman out of her home, Mom," I replied evenly. "You are selling the soil she spent her entire life working to a fracking company so your son can pay off his credit cards." Diane's carefully maintained composure shattered. She gripped the heavy crystal vase with both hands, the water inside sloshing dangerously near the brim. A harsh, ugly red flush crept up her neck, staining her collarbone. The veneer of the sophisticated country club socialite peeled away, revealing the terrified, cornered woman underneath. "You have no right to judge us," she hissed, her voice escalating into a piercing octave. "You sit up there in your dirty oil town, hoarding your paychecks, pretending you are superior. You never help this family." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my chest. "You have never lifted a single finger to assist your brother. Do you know the kind of stress he is under? He is navigating a complex market," Diane continued, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "He is taking risks that people like you could never comprehend. You punch a clock. You take orders. Wyatt is a creator. He is trying to build an empire that will elevate this entire family name, and yes, sometimes that requires difficult sacrifices. Your father understands that. I understand that." I watched her chest heave with the effort of her own delusions. The psychological gymnastics required to transform the theft of a widow's farm into a noble sacrifice were breathtaking. Diane had built a fortress of denial so thick that no amount of logic, empathy, or truth could penetrate the walls. She was willing to burn Inez to the ground if it meant keeping the country club invitations arriving in the mail. "If you had half his ambition." Diane spat, her eyes flashing with pure resentment. "If you actually contributed to this family instead of just taking up space, maybe you would have a say in these decisions. But you do not." I stood in the immaculate kitchen listening to my mother rewrite history with staggering conviction. She genuinely believed her own narrative. In her mind, she was the valiant matriarch protecting her visionary son from a cruel, unsupportive world. She erased every silent bailout, every mortgage payment I covered, and every financial crisis I intercepted. She cast me as the antagonist of her story, a greedy obstacle standing in the way of Wyatt's inevitable triumph. She required a villain to excuse her own moral bankruptcy, and I was the most convenient target. She dismissed me with a sharp, disgusted wave of her hand, turning her back to focus on the imported lilies. That gesture provided the exact clarity I needed. Any lingering trace of guilt, any small daughterly instinct whispering that I should try to save them from themselves, evaporated into the lemon-scented air. They did not want to be saved. They wanted to consume everything in their path to preserve a lie. I did not argue. I did not pull out the stack of bank transfer receipts to prove her wrong. The time for presenting evidence to a delusional jury was over. The verdict was already decided. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I strode down the hallway, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped back into the freezing afternoon air. I climbed into the cab of my truck, the engine roaring to life with a turn of the key. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a profound, dangerous calm settle over my mind. She had deliberately assigned me the role of the ungrateful, destructive villain. I shifted the truck into gear, steering away from the manicured subdivision. It was finally time to play the part they had given me and introduce them to the lethal reality of the paperwork waiting inside a downtown law office. The morning sun cast long, brittle shadows across the frosted pavement of downtown Bismarck. I parked my truck outside a sleek, modern glass building that housed the most ruthless legal minds in the state. Inez sat in the passenger seat, her posture rigid, her hands resting on the leather tote bag resting in her lap. We did not exchange nervous glances. We stepped out into the freezing wind and walked through the revolving doors, leaving the messy, emotional theater of my family behind us. We were entering a realm governed by cold, unyielding arithmetic. Victor Henderson operated his estate law practice from a corner suite on the 14th floor. He was a man devoid of sentimentality. His suits were tailored with surgical precision, and his office featured stark, minimalist furniture that offered zero comfort to grieving families. He specialized in untangling hostile inheritances, dissolving bitter partnerships, and executing airtight financial traps. He did not care about the drama of the Bismarck Country Club. He cared about leverage. Inez and I took our seats across from his polished granite desk. I unzipped my briefcase and pulled out a thick accordion-style file folder. This was not the green agricultural ledger. That book remained in Inez's tote, chronicling the daily expenses. The folder I placed on the granite surface contained the foundational architecture of the trap I laid a decade ago. I opened the flap and slid a stack of notarized documents toward Victor. 10 years prior, when my mother called me sobbing about their impending foreclosure, I refused to just hand them a check. I understood the predatory nature of my parents long before I had the vocabulary to define it. Instead of gifting them the funds, I hired a discreet financial proxy. I formed a blind holding company named Winter Root Capital. Through that corporate entity, I approached their original lender. Banks despise holding non-performing residential loans. They prefer liquidity. Winter Root Capital offered to purchase the distressed debt outright for the exact amount of the arrears, assuming the position of the primary lien holder. The bank gladly executed the sale. They mailed my father a dense, jargon-filled notice stating his mortgage servicing had been transferred to a new entity, and his penalties were restructured under a revised promissory note. Martin, blinded by his own arrogance and relieved to dodge the foreclosure, signed the new terms without consulting an attorney. He never read the fine print. He assumed it was a bureaucratic miracle granted to a man of his standing. He had zero idea he was legally binding his estate to his own daughter. Victor picked up the original promissory note. His sharp eyes scanned the paragraphs, his silver pen tapping a steady rhythm against a legal pad. He noted the default clauses, the penalty structures, and the compounding interest rate attached to the principal balance. For a decade, I never collected a single monthly payment. I allowed the debt to sit dormant, gathering interest in the dark. Every time I wired funds to cover their subsequent emergencies, I funneled the cash through Winter Root Capital, legally structuring the bailouts as additional lines of credit drawn against their initial collateral. Victor finished reading the final page. A faint, razor-thin smile appeared on his usually stoic face. He looked up, tapping the stack of paper. "This is an ironclad instrument, Kara," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Your father pledged all present and future physical assets to secure this initial restructuring. Because he ceased making payments the moment the ink dried, the compounding interest has triggered every penalty clause in the contract." He turned toward his computer monitor, his fingers flying across the keyboard to run the amortization schedule. The printer hummed, spitting out a single sheet of paper detailing the current payoff amount. He slid the page across the granite desk. The number printed in bold black ink was staggering. The original $40,000 bailout, combined with a decade of compound interest late fees and the subsequent credit lines I extended for Wyatt's vehicles and insurance premiums, had ballooned into a crippling liability. We cross-referenced the figure against the current market valuation of Martin's 50% stake in the Minot farm. The debt eclipsed the value of his inheritance by a significant margin. He owned nothing. His share of the dirt belonged entirely to Winterroot Capital. Inez leaned forward, reading the number. She did not flinch. "File the encumbrance," she ordered, her tone carrying the authority of a woman who had weathered countless prairie storms. "Lock the gate." Victor did not waste a second. He drafted a crushing mechanics lien and a notice of default targeting the specific agricultural parcel my father intended to sell. He dispatched a junior associate to the county courthouse to record the filings immediately. Within 2 hours, the pristine title of the Minot acreage transformed into a toxic, tangled legal nightmare. The trap was officially armed, and the trigger was handed directly to the corporate buyers. 2 days later, Marcus Vance, the acquisition manager for Prairie Basin Energy Development, initiated the standard due diligence protocol. Corporate legal teams operate on strict risk mitigation policies. They demand clean, unencumbered titles before transferring a single cent of capital. The fracking subsidiary's attorneys ran a search on the Minot property, expecting a simple transfer of deed from 2 cooperating family members. Instead, red flags erupted across their screens. They discovered a hostile lien holder, Winterroot Capital, asserting an immediate claim on half the property for a sum approaching $500,000. The title was hopelessly clouded. To a corporate energy firm, untangling a bitter, high-stakes debt dispute is a waste of billable hours and operational resources. They despise messy acquisitions. Marcus Vance did not call my father to negotiate. He drafted a formal cease and desist letter. Prairie Basin Energy Development officially paused their offer, suspending all appraisal and soil testing activities until the title could be delivered free and clear of all external claims. The sale was effectively paralyzed, frozen in legal amber. The notification arrived at my parents' pristine subdivision on the Thursday morning. I could envision the exact moment Martin opened the certified envelope. I could picture the color draining from his face as he read the corporate rejection letter. He and Diane had already spent weeks celebrating their impending windfall. They had likely boasted to their country club peers about their brilliant real estate maneuver. They believed they were days away from cashing a monumental check that would wipe Wyatt's slate clean and preserve their fabricated prestige. Suddenly, the escape hatch slammed shut, bolted from the outside, by a faceless holding company they did not recognize. The legal blockade bought Inez and me the crucial time we needed to solidify the trust documents, but it triggered a catastrophic chain reaction inside Bismarck. You can predict the behavior of a satisfied animal, but cornered predators operate on pure irrational instinct. They do not surrender when trapped. They bare their teeth. They lash out at whoever stands closest. My father and brother were abruptly cut off from their only source of salvation. Wyatt's creditors were no longer accepting promises of future fracking money. The repo men were circling his leased vehicles. The high-interest lenders were drafting lawsuits. The quiet, luxurious life they built on fraudulent foundations was buckling under the crushing weight of reality. The blocked sale sent Martin and Wyatt into a spiral of intense, suffocating desperation. They frantically searched for a target to blame, unaware that the architect of their ruin was sitting in a climate-controlled dispatch center watching the logistics grid. Wyatt needed someone to punish. His impending doom stripped away his polished exterior, leaving behind a frantic, dangerous man running out of time. His panic was about to drive him straight to my doorstep, carrying a secret that would elevate his financial failure into a criminal catastrophe. The Williston Dispatch Center hummed with a quiet, synchronized efficiency. I stood behind my desk, tracking 3 separate fleets of heavy transport trucks across dual digital mapping monitors. The glass walls of my office overlooked a floor of focused coordinators managing the intricate supply chain of the regional energy sector. It was an environment built on precision accountability and consequence. Mistakes here cost millions. We did not tolerate bluffing. My brother operated in a universe entirely detached from accountability. He survived on charm, borrowed equity, and the relentless shielding provided by our parents. But reality possesses a unique talent for catching up with fiction, and Wyatt's reality walked through my glass office doors on a Tuesday afternoon. He bypassed the front reception desk, ignoring the protests of the security guard. Wyatt looked nothing like the polished, arrogant developer who had sneered at me over the phone weeks prior. His tailored suit jacket was wrinkled, hanging loosely off his shoulders. Sweat beaded along his hairline, plastering dark strands against his forehead. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked hunted. He stormed into my office, breathing heavily, and slammed both hands flat against the surface of my desk. The sharp sound drew the attention of several coordinators on the floor, but I raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice cracking under the strain. I did not break eye contact. I slowly closed the laptop screen in front of me, giving him my undivided attention. I asked him to clarify his question. "Do not play innocent with me, Kara," he spat, leaning his weight onto his palms. "The Prairie Basin deal is paralyzed. The acquisition manager called Dad this morning. They pulled the title records. Some shadow entity called Winterroot Capital filed a crushing lien against the Minot acreage. Dad hired a lawyer to trace the limited liability registration. The holding company belongs to you. You placed an encumbrance on our own father." Wyatt's chest heaved. He stared at me, expecting denial, expecting the meek sister he had bullied his entire life to shrink under his fury. Instead, I folded my hands on the desk. "You aren't getting Grandma's farm, Wyatt," I stated, my tone flat and unyielding. "The property is locked, the developer is gone. You will have to figure out how to pay your creditors using your own money." The words struck him like a physical blow. The last remnants of his arrogant facade shattered, exposing the terrified, frantic core of a man realizing his safety net had vanished. His knees buckled slightly. He gripped the edge of my desk to steady himself, the heavy gold Rolex sliding down his wrist, a glaring symbol of the debt currently suffocating him. "You do not understand the math, Kara," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around my office, as if searching for a hidden exit. "You think this is just about stopping a real estate transaction. You think this is a game to teach me a lesson." I remained silent, letting him drown in his own panic. Then the true depth of his depravity spilled out. A cornered narcissist will always reveal their darkest secrets when they believe it might force someone else to save them. "I did not just wait for the closing date," Wyatt whispered, his voice trembling so hard the syllables blurred together. "I needed capital immediately. My lenders were preparing to seize my business accounts. I contacted Prairie Basin weeks ago. I negotiated an early execution clause. They agreed to release a non-refundable six-figure advance to secure the drilling rights ahead of schedule. He paused, swallowing hard. To release the funds, they required a preliminary binding contract. He continued, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. They needed signatures from all the title holders. I stared at him, the cold logic clicking into place. Martin and Inez had not signed any preliminary contracts. My father was waiting for the final appraisal, and my grandmother was entirely ignorant of the sale until I informed her. You forged their signatures, I said. Wyatt squeezed his eyes shut, nodding once. It was a bridging loan, he pleaded, attempting to justify the unjustifiable. It was supposed to be a temporary measure. Once the final sale closed, the advance would just be deducted from Dad's half of the profits. Nobody would have ever known. I took the advance and paid off the immediate commercial lenders breathing down my neck. The cash is gone, Kara. I spent it. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity hung in the air between us. Wyatt had not merely committed a moral failing. He had escalated his financial mismanagement into a severe felony. By signing Inez and Martin's names on corporate documents to extract a six-figure sum across state lines, he had crossed into the realm of federal jurisdiction. If the sale does not clear the title phase, I said, carefully outlining the nightmare he had built for himself, Prairie Basin will audit the preliminary contract. Their legal department will demand the return of the advance. When you fail to produce the cash, they will investigate the signatures. They will discover the forgery. Wyatt opened his eyes, staring at me with a hollow, terrified expression. They are going to hand me over to the authorities, Kara. It is not a civil dispute anymore. It is federal wire fraud. I am facing a prison sentence. He reached across the desk, his fingers grasping at the sleeve of my sweater. You have to lift the lien. You have to call your attorney right now and dissolve Winterroot Capital. Let the sale go through. You are my sister. You cannot send me to a federal penitentiary. I looked down at his trembling hand, then back up to his face. I felt no pity. I felt no sisterly obligation. I was looking at a man who had willingly drafted plans to throw an 80-year-old widow onto the street to cover his own vanity. The fact that his greed had blinded him to the legal consequences of forgery was a testament to the reckless environment our parents had cultivated for him. They had taught him that rules did not apply to the Golden Son, and the real world was about to deliver a harsh, unforgiving correction. I pulled my arm back, breaking his grip. I am not dissolving the lien, I answered. The farm stays with Inez. Wyatt stared at me, the desperation in his eyes hardening into a frantic, cornered rage. The realization that I was immune to his pleading triggered a vicious shift in his demeanor. If he could not charm me or beg me into submission, he would resort to the only tactic he had left. He would try to destroy me. He straightened his posture, wiping a bead of sweat from his cheek. His breathing slowed, settling into a rhythm of pure, unadulterated spite. If I go down, you are coming with me, he whispered viciously, leaning over the monitors. I will ruin you, Kara. I will return to Bismarck and tell every single person in our social circle that you defrauded our own father. I will tell them you manipulated the banking system to steal his inheritance. I will make sure you are radioactive. You will not be able to show your face in any church, at any family gathering, or in any business meeting in the state. I will ensure our parents dedicate the rest of their lives to ruining your reputation. He waited for my reaction, desperate to see a flicker of fear. He wanted me to bargain, to protect my standing in a family that had never valued me. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. Wyatt, you cannot ruin a reputation I stopped caring about 10 years ago. I pointed toward the glass sliding doors. Get out of my office. He stood frozen for a long second, his chest heaving, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack his teeth. He realized he possessed zero leverage. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the dispatch center, shoving past a returning driver. I watched him disappear down the corridor, knowing the threat he leveled was not an empty bluff. Wyatt and my parents were incapable of self-reflection. Instead of accepting the catastrophic reality of his wire fraud, they would double down on their delusions. They would need a scapegoat to deflect the impending disgrace, and they would launch a psychological war designed to break my spirit before the authorities knocked on their door. The battle was moving from the shadows into the public square. They were going to try to burn my name to the ground, and I was going to let them strike every match, knowing I held the only extinguisher. Wyatt fled Williston and drove straight back to Bismarck, carrying the terrifying reality of his federal forgery with him. He knew the clock was ticking down to his inevitable ruin. The moment the corporate acquisition team audited the preliminary contract, his fake empire would collapse into a criminal indictment. To survive, he and my parents needed to construct a diversion so overwhelming that the local community would focus entirely on a fabricated villain, giving Wyatt a smokescreen to hide behind while they searched for a legal workaround. They launched a calculated, vindictive psychological war. In a tight-knit Midwestern city, reputation operates as the primary currency. My mother understood how to manipulate that currency better than anyone. Diane did not take out a billboard or shout in the town square. She weaponized her social network over catered luncheons, charity committee meetings, and Sunday sermons. She wore her favorite cashmere sweaters, painting her face with a tragic, long-suffering expression. And she whispered her poison into the ears of every influential woman in her circle. Her narrative was a masterpiece of fiction. According to Diane, her younger daughter had grown bitter and resentful out of pure jealousy. She told her peers that Kara, the uneducated oil patch dispatcher, could not handle seeing her older brother achieve visionary success in the commercial real estate sector. To enact her petty revenge, this jealous daughter had exploited a minor clerical error in an old family trust, using shady lawyers to freeze the impending sale of the Minot farm. The lie was brilliant because it fed directly into the prejudices of their elite social circle. It cast Wyatt as the tragic, thwarted entrepreneur and framed me as the greedy, uncultured spinster trying to bankrupt her own flesh and blood. The rumors swept through the Bismarck community like a prairie fire over dry grass. I felt the shift in the atmosphere almost immediately during my rare visits back to the city. One evening, after a long shift at the dispatch center, I stopped at a high-end grocery market on the affluent side of town to pick up coffee beans for Inez. The store was a common gathering place for Diane's country club acquaintances. I walked down the produce aisle wearing my standard faded denim jacket and work boots. A woman named Mrs. Gable, who had attended the same Rotary dinners as my father for 20 years, stood near the imported citrus. She looked up and caught my eye. Her polite smile instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, chilling scowl. She did not say a word to me. She simply turned her shopping cart around, the wheels squeaking loudly against the polished floor, and marched in the opposite direction. A few aisles over, two women in designer tennis skirts stopped their conversation the moment I walked past. I felt their judgment burning into my spine. I heard the sharp, intentional intake of breath, followed by a hushed whisper containing the words, "shameful" and "ungrateful." I walked to the cashier, paid for my items in silence, and stepped out into the freezing parking lot. When I climbed into the cab of my truck, a notification flashed on my dashboard screen. I had a new voicemail. I pressed the playback button, listening to the audio through the vehicle speakers. It was my Aunt Joanne, my father's older sister. Her voice trembled with a fierce, self-righteous anger. "I just spoke with your mother, Kara." She began skipping any form of greeting. "I cannot fathom the darkness in your heart. After everything Martin and Diane provided for you, you choose to stab them in the back. You are holding your own brother hostage over sheer spite. You are a traitor to your blood. Do not bother showing up for the holidays. You are no longer welcome in our homes." The recording ended with a sharp click. I sat in the cold cabin watching my breath fog the windshield. 10 years ago, a message like that would have crushed my spirit. I would have drafted a frantic apology begging for their understanding, desperate to reclaim my place in the family hierarchy. Now the words felt hollow. They were defending a mirage. The dramatic irony surrounding their smear campaign was thick enough to cut with a knife. While Joanne left scathing voicemails and Diane played the victim at the country club, Martin was busy boasting to his golfing partners about the impending fracking windfall. He strutted through the clubhouse lounges, projecting the image of a wealthy landowner on the verge of a monumental cash infusion. He assured his peers that the delay was merely a brief bureaucratic hurdle caused by his estranged daughter's incompetence. He was selling tickets to a ship that had already sunk. They were entirely unaware that I held the keys to their destruction locked inside a fireproof safe at Victor Henderson's office. I held the defaulted promissory note. I owned the debt on their pristine house. I controlled the holding company that paralyzed the land sale. While they bragged over expensive cocktails, Wyatt was likely pacing the floors of his Fargo apartment, sweating through his clothes, terrified that every knock on his door was a federal investigator holding a warrant for wire fraud. Through the entire social onslaught, I said nothing. I did not log on to social media to defend my character. I did not call Aunt Joanne to explain the forged signatures or the unpaid mortgage. I refused to engage with their manufactured drama. I simply went to work. I sat behind the glass walls of my office, drank black coffee, and managed my logistical fleets. I orchestrated the movement of heavy steel across the frozen North Dakota plains, watching my personal wealth grow with every successful delivery. My silence frustrated them deeply. A smear campaign requires the target to react. When the target ignores the attacks, the aggressors are left swinging at empty air, expending their energy while the underlying crisis continues to rot beneath their feet. On Sunday morning, I drove out to the farm to deliver the coffee beans to Inez. The sky hung low and gray, promising an impending snowstorm. The farmhouse kitchen was warm, smelling of roasted pecans and burning cedar. Inez sat at the heavy oak table, carefully polishing a set of antique silver spoons she only used for special occasions. She operated with a slow, deliberate grace, entirely unaffected by the toxic gossip swirling 3 hours south of her property. I placed the bag of coffee on the counter and sat across from her. I relayed the details of the grocery store encounter and summarized the blistering voicemail from Joanne. I watched her face, searching for any sign of distress or sorrow regarding the fractured family dynamics. Inez did not frown. She set down a shining silver spoon and reached for a soft polishing cloth. Her green agricultural ledger rested at the corner of the table, an ever-present reminder of the cold, hard mathematics governing our lives. She reached out and patted the frayed fabric cover of the book. "Let them talk, Kara," she said, her voice steady and resolute. She picked up another spoon, inspecting the intricate pattern carved into the handle. People who build their lives on lies always scream the loudest when the truth starts walking toward their front door. They are building a high pedestal out of gossip and vanity. She leveled her sharp, clear gaze at me. The louder they yell, the harder they hit the ground when the rug gets pulled. Do not interrupt an enemy when they are busy destroying their own credibility. She was right. The social warfare was a distraction, a desperate, flailing motion from a family rapidly running out of oxygen. The whispering campaigns and the scornful looks could not dissolve the crushing lien I had placed on the property. The rumors could not generate the six-figure sum Wyatt needed to replace the stolen corporate advance. Martin and Wyatt soon realized their psychological tactics were failing. My resolute silence proved that public shaming held zero leverage over my decisions. They could not bully me into lifting the legal blockade, and the deadline for the corporate title audit was creeping closer with every passing day. They needed a new strategy. They required a mechanism to bypass my authority entirely, a legal loophole that would allow them to authorize the sale without my consent or the holding company's approval. Martin realized he could not break my resolve, so he turned his predatory focus toward the perceived weak link in our alliance. He shifted his sights away from his daughter and aimed directly at his own mother. He decided to leverage her advanced age against her, preparing to launch a legal strike so devoid of morality it would forever alter the fabric of our family. The battle for the farm was about to escalate into a terrifying fight for my grandmother's fundamental human rights. The countdown reached its final stage 5 days before Inez was scheduled to turn 80. The winter sky outside my Williston office had bruised into a deep, heavy purple, signaling another dense snowfall sweeping across the plains. The dispatch floor beyond my glass walls had quieted to a steady operational hum, the evening shift settling into their logistics rhythms. I sat at my desk, reviewing transport manifests, when the internal line blinked. The voicemail indicator glowed a steady crimson. I pressed the speaker button, expecting a routine update from a field supervisor. Instead, the sterile office filled with the sound of my father's voice. He did not yell. The time for performative anger had passed, replaced by a cold, hollow tone that sent a distinct chill down my spine. Martin sounded like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, deciding to push someone else over to break his own fall. Listen to me very carefully, Kara. He began the digital recording, capturing the faint sound of ice clinking in a glass. You think you hold the cards because you hid behind a corporate shield. You think paralyzing the title search makes you the victor. You are testing my patience, and you are hurting your brother. Since you refuse to act like a rational member of this family, I am forced to take decisive action to protect our assets. He paused, taking a slow, measured breath. I have spoken with a litigator here in Bismarck, Martin continued, his voice dropping an octave. Your grandmother is 80 years old. She lives alone in an isolated rural farmhouse. Her recent decisions regarding the property are highly irregular. Refusing a highly lucrative corporate buyout is not the behavior of a sound mind. It demonstrates a severe cognitive decline. Next week, I am filing a formal petition with the state to declare Inez medically incompetent. The air in my office seemed to thin out. I stopped breathing, my hand hovering over the keyboard. Once the court grants me full medical and financial power of attorney, Martin said, articulating every syllable with deliberate cruelty, I will assume legal guardianship over her estate. I will have the authority to dissolve whatever fraudulent agreements you think you established. I will act on her behalf, consent to the Prairie Basin drilling contract, and finalize the sale to secure Wyatt's future. You cannot stop a court-appointed guardian. Kara, lift the encumbrance today, or I will initiate the proceedings on Monday morning. The recording clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. I sat frozen in my ergonomic chair. The sheer depravity of his ultimatum echoed in the quiet room. He was proposing the nuclear option. To shield Wyatt from the federal consequences of his forged signatures, Martin was willing to strip his own mother of her fundamental human rights. He planned to march into a courtroom and perjure himself, branding a sharp, fiercely independent woman as a victim of dementia. He wanted to steal her autonomy, lock her in a legal cage, and pillage her sanctuary, all to maintain the fictional narrative of his golden son. A profound, icy resolve flooded my veins. For years, I had navigated my family with a defensive posture, absorbing their blows and quietly patching the holes they punched into our lives. I kept my head down, hoping my silent sacrifices would eventually earn their respect. But listening to that voicemail, the final remnants of my passive endurance shattered. The winter wheat roots buried deep in the frozen North Dakota earth for a decade finally broke through the frost. I did not pick up the phone to call him back. I did not attempt to reason with a man who had abandoned his conscience. Instead, I dialed Victor Henderson. The estate attorney answered on the second ring, his tone brisk and professional despite the late hour. I recounted the contents of the voicemail, repeating Martin's threat to seize guardianship. Victor offered a low, dry chuckle that carried zero humor. "Let him try," Victor replied, the sound of papers shuffling transmitting through the receiver. "We anticipated this exact maneuver, Kara. It is the predictable last resort of a desperate beneficiary." Months prior, when Inez and I first suspected my parents might target the farm, we did not merely draft a trust. We built an impenetrable legal fortress. At Victor's instruction, I had taken Inez to 2 separate, independent, board-certified neurologists in Minot. Both specialists conducted exhaustive cognitive evaluations. Both doctors signed sworn, notarized affidavits declaring Inez possessed pristine mental acuity and full executive function. Furthermore, Inez had executed a durable power of attorney and an ironclad healthcare directive, legally naming me as her sole proxy should she ever become incapacitated. Martin's threatened petition was dead on arrival. If he dared to file the paperwork, Victor would present the medical affidavits and the prior directives to the judge, resulting in Martin facing severe sanctions for filing a frivolous and fraudulent claim. "Finalize the trust documents," I instructed Victor, my voice steady and unyielding. "Transfer the deed entirely into the irrevocable structure. Remove his name from everything the law permits." "Consider it done," Victor confirmed. "The trap is sealed." With the legal perimeter secured, I turned my attention to the surreal theater playing out in Bismarck. Despite the looming specter of Wyatt's federal wire fraud charges, despite the frozen land sale, and despite the catastrophic debt I held over their heads, my parents refused to cancel the impending birthday celebration. Their devotion to optics superseded their instinct for survival. Canceling the 80th birthday dinner for the family matriarch would invite questions from the extended relatives. It would signal weakness. It would crack the immaculate facade they had spent decades polishing. They desperately needed an audience to validate their existence. They required a room full of aunts, uncles, and cousins to witness their generosity and reinforce their status as the successful, benevolent leaders of the Aguilar clan. Diane sent a group text message to the family the following morning, her digital tone dripping with manufactured enthusiasm. She detailed the reservations at the most exclusive steakhouse in the city, boasting about the private mahogany banquet room and the imported champagne she had pre-ordered. She was orchestrating a lavish spectacle while standing on the deck of a sinking ship. A few hours later, a separate direct message illuminated my phone screen. It was from my mother, devoid of any warmth. "We expect you to be in attendance," Diane wrote. "Do not cause a scene. This night is about honoring your grandmother, despite the tension you have brought into this family. Wear something appropriate." She was demanding my presence to complete her tableau. She needed the estranged blue-collar daughter sitting quietly at the edge of the table to highlight Wyatt's fabricated brilliance. She believed her hushed threats and Martin's chilling voicemail had sufficiently intimidated me into submission. They thought I would arrive with my head bowed, terrified by the prospect of the incompetency hearing, ready to surrender the farm to save Inez from a brutal court battle. They possessed no idea that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I typed a 2-word reply. I will be there. The pressure cooker was officially sealed, the heat rising to an unprecedented degree. I spent the next 3 days finalizing my operational schedules at the dispatch center, ensuring the logistics grid could run without my supervision for the weekend. I drove to a boutique in downtown Williston and purchased a tailored charcoal gray dress, shedding the faded denim and work boots they expected me to wear. I visited the local bank branch, retrieving a thick stack of certified transfer receipts from my safe deposit box, folding them carefully into a leather envelope. On Friday evening, I drove south to Minot to pick up Inez. She was waiting on her front porch, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, her weathered leather tote bag resting beside her boots. She climbed into the passenger seat, the green agricultural ledger safely tucked inside her bag. We navigated the icy highway toward Bismarck in comfortable silence, 2 women armed with a decade of undeniable truth, driving straight into the heart of an illusion. The stage was set, the audience was gathering, and the curtain was about to rise on a performance they would never forget. Which brings us back to the rented banquet room. Stepping through the heavy double doors of the Bismarck Hotel felt like crossing the threshold into a carefully curated theater production. The private dining area boasted dark mahogany paneling, towering floral centerpieces crafted from imported orchids, and cascading crystal chandeliers casting a warm, golden glow across the starched, white linen tablecloths. It was a space designed to project unassailable affluence and command immediate respect. My mother had spared no expense orchestrating every single detail, from the engraved place cards to the silver flatware, to reinforce her preferred narrative of prosperity. I walked into the room beside Grandma Inez. I did not wear the faded denim jacket or the scuffed work boots my relatives expected. The tailored charcoal gray dress I purchased in downtown Williston fit perfectly, serving as a subtle but undeniable armor. I paired it with simple silver earrings and a steady, unyielding posture. When Diane spotted us near the entrance, her practiced hostess smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The muscles in her jaw tightened. She had anticipated a broken, humiliated daughter shuffling in to seek forgiveness. Instead, she faced a woman radiating quiet, impenetrable resolve. The seating arrangement was a masterclass in social manipulation. Diane placed Martin at the head of the long rectangular table, positioning Wyatt immediately to his right in the undisputed seat of honor. Inez was seated near the center, and I was relegated to the chair beside her, flanked by Aunt Joanne and a distant cousin who had spent the last month absorbing my mother's toxic rumors. The evening unfolded as a grueling exercise in passive hostility. As the waitstaff served courses of roasted beef tenderloin and glazed asparagus, the conversations flowing around me felt sharp and intentional. Aunt Joanne pointedly ignored my presence, directing all her inquiries toward Wyatt. She asked him about his latest commercial developments, praising his entrepreneurial spirit with excessive enthusiasm. Wyatt attempted to play the part of the triumphant visionary, but his performance cracked under the crushing strain of his impending doom. He sat across the table, swirling a heavy crystal glass of scotch. He was sweating through his tailored suit jacket, a thin sheen of perspiration clinging to his forehead, despite the cool blast of the hotel air conditioning. His eyes darted nervously toward the mahogany doors every few minutes. When a busboy accidentally dropped a dessert spoon on a serving tray, Wyatt physically flinched, acting like a man anticipating federal agents to interrupt the meal with an arrest warrant. To self-medicate his terror, he drank quickly, draining his glass and signaling the waiter for frequent, urgent refills. Whenever he reached across the table for a piece of artisan bread or a silver salt shaker, his cuff rode up, exposing the $15,000 Rolex gleaming under the chandelier light. He wore the stolen luxury like a shield, desperate to convince the room of his boundless success, while secretly knowing the timepiece represented a mere fraction of the forged corporate advance currently destroying his life. Martin dominated the ambient chatter. He projected the aura of a benevolent king holding court. He loudly hinted to his siblings that a highly lucrative land deal was mere days away from closing. He sold them the fantasy of an impending fracking windfall, promising that the Aguilar legacy was entering a new, unprecedented era of wealth. He was doubling down on a dead hand, banking on the delusion that his threat of an incompetency hearing would force my complete surrender before the courthouse opened on Monday morning. I ate my dinner in silence, observing the tragic comedy playing out in front of me. I felt the cold condensation on my water goblet. I smoothed the fabric of my dress. I grounded myself in the physical reality of the room, while my family spun elaborate fictions. I felt no urge to defend myself against the thinly veiled insults tossed in my direction. I did not react when Diane loudly lamented the tragedy of ungrateful children to a sympathetic aunt. My pulse remained steady. The anxiety that used to govern my interactions with these people had evaporated, replaced by a profound clinical detachment. By the time the servers cleared the dinner plates and distributed delicate porcelain bowls of vanilla bean creme brulee, the tension in the room had thickened into a tangible force. The steady flow of expensive wine had loosened tongues and fortified Martin's arrogance. He decided the moment had arrived to deliver his final public blow. He wanted to cement his narrative, elevate his son, and break my spirit in front of a captive audience. Martin picked up his silver dessert spoon and tapped it sharply against the rim of his crystal wine glass. The bright, ringing sound cut through the low murmur of conversation like a blade. The room of 20 people quieted instantly. Faces turned toward the head of the table. Conversations halted in mid-sentence. Martin stood buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced flourish. He offered a warm, paternal smile to the gathered relatives, resting his hand affectionately on Wyatt's shoulder. "We are gathered tonight to honor the matriarch of this family." Martin began, his voice carrying the polished, rhythmic cadence of a seasoned politician addressing a crowd. "My mother Inez taught us the value of hard work, perseverance, and unwavering loyalty. She built a foundation that allowed the next generation to reach for the stars." He paused, letting the sentimental platitude wash over the guests. "And nobody embodies that legacy better than my son Martin," continued, his grip tightening on Wyatt's shoulder. "Wyatt has faced turbulent markets. He has navigated brutal economic headwinds, but he never wavered. He stands as a testament to genuine ambition. He builds, he strives, and he honors the Aguilar name through his sheer determination. He is the future of this family." A murmur of agreement rippled through the guests. Aunt Joanne beamed with unearned pride. Diane brought a linen napkin to her eye, performing the role of the overwhelmed, joyful mother with theatrical precision. Wyatt offered a tight, forced smile, raising his scotch glass in a silent toast, his hand trembling so severely the amber liquid sloshed against the rim. Then the atmosphere shifted. Martin dropped the paternal warmth. His features hardened into a mask of pure contempt. His eyes locked onto me with a sudden, freezing intensity. The silence in the banquet room grew heavy, suffocating, as everyone sensed the impending strike. "It is a shame," Martin boomed, his voice dripping with venom, projecting his words so they bounced off the mahogany walls, "that some people scheme. Some people possess no concept of loyalty." He stared directly into my eyes, refusing to look away, determined to force my submission through sheer intimidation. "Kara, you have never lifted a finger for this family," he stated, pronouncing each word like a judge delivering a guilty verdict. "You have hoarded your wealth. You have disrespected your brother, and you have turned your back on the very people who raised you." The brutality of the public reprimand caused a few cousins to gasp softly. Aunt Joanne nodded in stern agreement, validating the unprovoked attack. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, the terror temporarily eclipsed by a surge of vindictive pleasure. He smirked, a slow, ugly curving of his lips. He adjusted his wrist, allowing the heavy gold Rolex to catch the ambient light, silently mocking my supposed defeat. To my left, Diane nodded, tragically cementing her status as the victim of a cruel, heartless daughter. The trap was perfectly set. The audience was captive, holding their collective breath, waiting for the inevitable outcome. They expected the tears. They expected me to push my chair back, apologize for my behavior, and run from the room in shame. They believed Martin had won the psychological war. The lie was out in the open, presented as irrefutable truth by the patriarch of the family. I sat perfectly still. My breathing remained slow and even. I did not break eye contact with my father. I offered him no tears, no apologies, and no defense. I let his venomous words hang in the silent air, allowing the profound injustice of his accusation to settle over the table. I didn't say a word. I just turned my head slightly and looked at Grandma Inez. She had finished her dessert. She wiped her mouth delicately with a white linen napkin and placed it on the table. Her expression was serene, displaying the calm resolve of a woman who had watched the storm gather and knew exactly how to redirect the lightning. Without rushing, she reached down into the weathered leather bag resting near her feet. She did not look at Martin. She did not look at Wyatt. She pulled out the heavy, frayed green agricultural ledger and placed it squarely on the pristine white tablecloth. The dull thud echoed in the silent room, a sound that would soon represent the collapse of an entire false empire. Grandma Inez pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping sharply against the carpeted floor. The sound was harsh, cutting through the stagnant air of the banquet room. She stood up slowly, planting her feet with the steady, grounded assurance of a woman who had spent decades weathering brutal North Dakota winters. You do not interrupt an 80-year-old woman on her birthday. Even Martin, standing at the head of the table with his chest puffed out, instinctively closed his mouth, the arrogant smirk freezing on his features. The green fabric cover of the ledger was worn, softened by years of daily use. She ran her fingertips over the binding, a subtle gesture of reverence for the truth contained within its pages. She adjusted her reading glasses, the delicate gold wire catching the chandelier light, and opened the book. The crisp snap of the turning page echoed in the breathless room. She bypassed the index and flattened the first line sheet with her palm. November 2016. Inez began. Her voice was clear, crisp, and biting as a prairie wind. Mortgage debt purchased to save Martin's primary residence from bank foreclosure. Amount, $40,000. Paid by Kara. The color drained from Martin's face in an instant, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw dropped. The crystal wine glass slipped from his grip, landing on the thick linen tablecloth with a muffled thud, a dark red stain blossoming outward like a bruised vein. The benevolent patriarch illusion shattered into dust. Inez did not pause to let him recover. She traced her index finger down to the next entry, her tone devoid of pity. June 2017. Down payment for Wyatt's gold Rolex timepiece. Amount, $15,000. Paid by Kara. Wyatt's smug expression vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked down at his own wrist as if the heavy metal watch had suddenly ignited, burning his skin. He yanked his arm beneath the table frantically, hiding the jewelry from the probing, horrified stares of his relatives. The cousins, who had just been admiring his entrepreneurial success, now looked at him with profound disgust. October 2020. Inez continued maintaining a steady, relentless cadence. Repair costs for the John Deere combine tractor following the incident where Wyatt drove the machinery into a drainage ditch amount $22,450, paid by Kara. Diane gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of breath. She had spent weeks spinning a heroic narrative around that specific tractor incident, telling the entire county that her son had valiantly managed a mechanical failure to save the harvest. Now her meticulously crafted social fiction lay exposed as a pathetic lie. She reached up, clutching her silk scarf, her manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric as if it were choking her. March 2019. The matriarch read her voice unwavering. Delinquent lease payments for Wyatt's luxury sedan, avoiding repossession by the dealership. Amount $8,200, paid by Kara. August 2021. Commercial property tax lien on Martin's Supply Warehouse. Amount $12,700, paid by Kara. December 2022. Diane's annual country club membership dues covering the initiation deficit. Amount $5,000, paid by Kara. April 2023. Emergency settlement funds to clear Wyatt's outstanding personal credit card judgments in Fargo. Amount $18,900, paid by Kara. The relentless recitation functioned like a hammer striking the same nail over and over again. She detailed the exact amounts, the precise dates, the routing digits, and the wire transfer confirmation numbers. Each line item stripped away another layer of their fraudulent prestige. Aunt Joanne, who had left the scathing voicemail days prior calling me a traitor to my blood, sat frozen, her mouth slightly open in stunned disbelief. The relatives who had nodded along with Martin's vicious insult mere minutes ago were now staring at their plates, suffocated by the heavy weight of the truth. September 2023, Inez stated. Premium payments for Martin's lapsed commercial liability insurance. Amount $9,300, paid by Kara. January 2024. Wyatt's unpaid legal retainers for prior business disputes. Amount $11,000, paid by Kara. For 3 solid minutes, Inez stood at the center of the mahogany room, serving as an impartial judge, delivering a decade-long verdict. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of their exposed greed. My parents had built their entire identity on a foundation of superiority, constantly demanding respect they had never earned. They paraded Wyatt around as the ultimate achievement, the visionary builder who would carry the family name into the stratosphere. Meanwhile, the uneducated logistics dispatcher they gleefully mocked had been silently subsidizing their delusions, carrying the crushing weight of their financial incompetence. I watched my father shrink. The broad shoulders that had commanded the room moments ago now slumped forward. His tailored suit seemed too large for his shrinking frame. He cast a desperate, pleading glance toward his sister Joanne, seeking an ally. But Joanne averted her eyes, unable to stomach the sheer scale of the deception. I watched my mother crumble. Diane's perfect posture dissolved. She stared at the floral centerpiece, her eyes wide and vacant, realizing her reign over the local social hierarchy was effectively terminated. The women in her circle would inevitably hear about this dinner. The whispers would begin tomorrow, and she possessed no defense against the certified bank records currently being read aloud. I watched my brother panic. Wyatt was hyperventilating, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic bursts. The exposure of his parasitic lifestyle was devastating. But the true terror lurking behind his eyes stemmed from a much darker reality. He knew the ledger was merely the prologue. He knew the unpaid loans and the luxury watches were trivial offenses compared to the federal forgery he had committed to secure the corporate advance. The financial safety net he relied upon was gone, burned to ash by his own grandmother. Inez turned to the final page of the ledger. She ran her finger down the last column of figures, tracing a thick red line she had drawn at the bottom of the page. She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the extended family, ensuring she held the undivided attention of every person in the room. "Grand total," Inez announced, her voice dropping into a somber, definitive register. "Funds expended to maintain the lifestyle, debts, and failures of Martin Diane and Wyatt Aguilar over the past 10 years. $142,550. She paused, letting the staggering figure echo off the crystal chandeliers. "Every single cent," she concluded, her eyes locking onto my father. "Paid by Kara." Inez closed the book. The heavy cover slapped against the remaining pages with a loud, definitive thud. It sounded like a gavel striking a wooden bench. She sat back down in her chair, placing her hands neatly in her lap, her duty fulfilled. When she finished, no one at the table could speak. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the uncomfortable quiet of a lull in conversation, nor the tense hush preceding an argument. It was a thick, paralyzing stillness born from total devastation. The rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hotel hallway drifted into the room, marking the passing seconds. Ice melted and shifted inside untouched water glasses. No one dared to pick up a fork. No one reached for a napkin. I sat in my chair, absorbing the atmosphere. For 30 years, I had occupied this family as a ghost, a convenient scapegoat utilized to absorb their failures and fund their vanities. I had conditioned myself to endure their insults, believing that silent endurance was the only path to peace. I was wrong. Peace did not come from enduring abuse. Peace came from exposing it to the harsh, unforgiving light. The quiet ringing in my ears faded, replaced by the deep, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I looked around the room, meeting the shocked gazes of my cousins, my aunts, my uncles. I saw the profound shift in their perception. I was no longer the tragic, jealous daughter they had been instructed to pity. I was the architect of their survival, the silent pillar holding up the roof they had just tried to collapse on my head. I inhaled a slow, deep breath of the lemon-scented air. The stillness stretching across the mahogany table was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a 10-year lie drawing its final, rattling breath. The quiet in the banquet room stretched into an unbearable void. Diane broke first. Her survival instinct overrode her logic. She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion causing her silk scarf to slip from her shoulder. She reached a trembling hand toward the center of the table, her eyes darting between the stunned relatives. "This is a fabrication," Diane stammered, her voice thin and reedy, devoid of its usual polished confidence. "Inez is confused. Her age is catching up with her. Kara has always resented us, and now she is exploiting an elderly woman's fading memory to humiliate her own flesh and blood. None of this is true." I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to defend my grandmother's pristine cognitive state. Arguing implies a negotiation of the truth, and I held no interest in negotiating. I reached down and picked up the leather envelope I had brought from Williston. I unfastened the brass clasp. Reaching inside, I retrieved a stack of paper an inch thick. These were not handwritten ledger entries. These were certified bank records, wire transfer confirmations, and cleared cashier checks, all bearing the official stamps of our financial institutions. I tossed the stack onto the center of the table. The heavy bundle landed right next to the floral centerpiece, sliding slightly across the white linen. "Pass them around," I instructed. Aunt Joanne, seated to my left, hesitated for a fraction of a second before her curiosity overpowered her loyalty to my father. She reached out with a manicured hand and pulled the top sheet toward her. It was the confirmation for the $15,000 wire transfer directed to the luxury watch dealership in Fargo. She traced the routing number with her index finger, her eyes widening as she verified my name listed as the sole originator of the funds. She passed the document to the cousin seated beside her and picked up the next page. The rustling of paper replaced the suffocating silence. The irrefutable proof circulated around the mahogany table. Relatives examined the tax lien payoffs, the insurance premium settlements, and the vehicle lease bailouts. The physical evidence dismantled Diane's desperate lie in real time. There was no room left for spin. There was no alternate narrative. My parents had been caught, living on stolen pride funded by the daughter they openly despised. Martin stared at the bank receipts passing from hand to hand. His chest caved inward. The fight drained out of him, leaving a hollow, defeated shell of a man. He looked at Inez, his eyes pleading for a reprieve, hoping his mother might offer a shred of mercy. Inez offered nothing but the cold, unvarnished reality. She placed her hands flat on the table, centering herself. "My farm is no longer vulnerable to your schemes, Martin," she announced, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of a final judgment. "The Minot acreage is now secured inside an irrevocable trust. You hold zero legal authority over the land, the equipment, or the operations. The trust is controlled entirely by Kara." Martin blinked, trying to process the magnitude of his loss. The fracking windfall he had promised his peers was gone. His golden ticket to sustain his fictional wealth had evaporated, but Inez was not finished. She delivered the final, crushing blow with surgical precision. Furthermore, she continued, her gaze locked onto her son. "Kara did not just pay your debts out of charity. She purchased them. The holding company that owns the delinquent mortgage on your Bismarck residence is Winterroot Capital. Kara is Winterroot Capital. She owns the paper on your house, Martin. You are living under a roof maintained by her grace." A collective gasp rippled through the extended family. The power dynamic in the room flipped with such forceful velocity it left the guests breathless. Martin was not just broke. He was effectively a tenant in a property controlled by the very daughter he had just attempted to publicly humiliate. His leverage was non-existent. His threats of an incompetency hearing were exposed as the pathetic thrashings of a desperate, cornered debtor. I stood up. I smoothed the fabric of my charcoal dress, feeling a profound sense of lightness settle into my bones. The invisible chains of obligation and seeking approval that had bound me to these people for 3 decades unraveled, falling away into the shadows of the banquet room. I turned my attention to Wyatt. He sat paralyzed in his chair, his complexion a pale, chalky white. The relatives scrutinizing the bank receipts believed they were witnessing the climax of his disgrace. They thought the exposure of his unearned luxury was the ultimate punishment. Wyatt and I were the only 2 people in the room who understood that this dinner was merely the prologue to his destruction. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a feral, trapped terror. He knew I was walking away. He knew the legal blockade on the farm would remain in place, triggering the corporate audit of the preliminary contract. The developer would discover the forged signatures. The federal investigators would follow the money trail. Wyatt was going to face the severe consequences of wire fraud entirely on his own. He had built a cage of deceit, locked himself inside, and handed me the only key. I was taking that key with me. "I am done lifting fingers," I said calmly. I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked toward the heavy double doors. Inez picked up her weathered leather tote, secured the green ledger inside, and followed close behind me. We exited the private dining area, our footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor of the hotel lobby. We left Martin, Diane, and Wyatt sitting in the ruins of their own making, surrounded by a jury of their peers, holding the undeniable evidence of their parasitic existence. We stepped out through the sliding glass doors into the freezing North Dakota night. The winter air was sharp, biting, and incredibly clear. The sleet had transitioned into a steady driving snow, coating the pavement in a pristine layer of white. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the frigid wind. For the first time in my life, the cold did not feel punishing. It felt purifying. It felt like freedom. 6 months later, the inevitable correction arrived. The corporate acquisition team at Prairie Basin Energy Development executed their standard audit on the stalled land deal. The discrepancies in the preliminary paperwork surfaced immediately. The legal department flagged the irregularities and forwarded the file to the regional authorities. The ensuing federal investigation moved with methodical, unforgiving speed. Wyatt's fake empire collapsed under the scrutiny. The authorities uncovered the forged signatures and traced the misappropriated six-figure advance directly to his desperate attempts to satisfy his commercial lenders. The grand jury handed down a staggering indictment. Wyatt lost his business, his leased vehicles, and his freedom, trading his tailored suits for the grim reality of a federal holding facility. The fallout shattered my parents' social standing. The Bismarck Country Club quietly revoked their membership. The wealthy friends they had courted for decades distanced themselves, terrified of the reputational damage associated with a high-profile fraud case. Unable to sustain the property taxes and the crushing weight of their accumulated liabilities, Martin and Diane were forced to vacate the pristine farmhouse. They retreated into a small, nondescript apartment on the edge of town, living out their days in self-imposed exile, surrounded by the bitter echoes of their lost prestige. I did not orchestrate their downfall. I simply stopped standing in the way of the consequences they had earned. As spring thawed the frozen plains, my logistics firm secured 3 new, lucrative contracts, expanding our operational footprint across the state. Our Williston Dispatch Center was operating at maximum capacity, and we required a secondary hub to manage the eastern routes. My commercial real estate broker notified me of a prime commercial property heading to a public foreclosure auction in Fargo. I drove down to the county courthouse on a bright, crisp Tuesday morning. The auctioneer stood on the granite steps reading through a list of distressed commercial assets. I stood in the back of the crowd, holding a cashier's check drawn from Winter Root Capital. The property on the block was a modern 3-story glass and steel office building located in the heart of the Fargo business district. It was the former headquarters of Wyatt's defunct real estate development firm. The bank was desperate to liquidate the asset, setting the opening bid at a fraction of its true market value. I raised my numbered paddle. The bidding was sparse, the local investors wary of the stigma attached to the building. Within 5 minutes, the auctioneer slammed his wooden gavel against the podium. I secured the property for pennies on the dollar. The ultimate poetic justice was not merely exposing my brother's fraud. It was watching my thriving company absorb the physical remnants of his failure, transforming his monument to vanity into an engine of genuine industry. A week later, I walked through the empty corridors of the Fargo building. The space was stripped bare, stripped of the pretentious artwork and the rented luxury furniture. It was a blank canvas. I stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows in the corner executive suite, looking out over the fertile river valleys stretching toward the horizon. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Inez containing a photograph of the vibrant green winter wheat pushing high above the thawing soil on her farm. The roots had held firm. The harvest was going to be exceptional. I put the phone back in my pocket and smiled. I directed my operations crew to begin installing the new dispatch monitors and the communication servers. I was standing on my own 2 feet, rooted deep in the rugged Midwestern earth, wealthy, unburdened, and ready to get to work. There is a distinct quiet mythology woven into the fabric of the traditional American family. We are taught from a very young age that the home is meant to be our primary fortress, a sanctuary of unconditional support where parents guide their children with a steady, equitable hand. We believe in the wholesome image of the Sunday dinner, the shared holidays, and the passing down of generational wisdom. But as we unpack the profound unraveling of Kara Aguilar's family, a saga that culminated in the devastating thud of Grandma Inez's green agricultural ledger on a banquet room table, we are forced to confront a much darker reality. Kara's journey is not merely a tale of financial betrayal or a dramatic dinner party exposé. It is a profound cautionary essay on the catastrophic failure of parenting values, the weaponization of family responsibility, and the tragic absence of long-term guidance. At the core of this narrative lies a fundamental perversion of the American dream. Kara's parents, Martin and Diane, fell victim to a cultural trap that snares countless families. They confused the appearance of success with the substance of character. In their desperate bid to maintain their status within their rural Midwestern community, they abandoned honesty and fairness, choosing instead to construct an elaborate illusion. They designated their son Wyatt as the golden child, the charismatic visionary who would elevate the family name. In doing so, they stripped him of the single most vital tool a parent can give a child: accountability. True long-term guidance requires the emotional awareness to let a child fail. It requires a parent to stand back and allow their offspring to feel the painful, stinging consequences of their own mistakes, knowing that this discomfort is the forge where resilience and integrity are hammered into shape. Martin and Diane shielded Wyatt from every consequence, utilizing Kara as a silent, unacknowledged safety net. When Wyatt lived beyond his means, when he crashed an expensive combine, and when he spiraled into insurmountable debt, his parents did not teach him responsibility. They taught him that the rules of gravity did not apply to him. They engineered his ultimate destruction, setting him on a path that led straight to federal wire fraud, simply because they lacked the courage to tell him no. They loved the idea of his success more than they loved the reality of their son. Contrast this with their treatment of Kara, the daughter, who actually embodied the rugged, hard-working ethos that built their community. In a truly fair and emotionally aware family structure, Kara's quiet diligence and extraordinary generosity would have been celebrated. She spent a decade of her life and over $140,000 of her hard-earned money quietly rescuing her parents and her brother from their own reckless choices. Yet instead of gratitude, she received scorn. The traditional family structure, when corrupted by ego, often relies on a designated scapegoat to absorb the tension and maintain the status quo. Kara was punished precisely because her competence and self-sufficiency held a mirror up to their collective inadequacy. This dynamic highlights a devastating deficit in emotional awareness. Martin and Diane were so consumed by the need to project a flawless image to their country club peers and church congregation that they lost the ability to perceive the emotional reality of their own children. They mistook Kara's stoic financial bailouts for submission and weakness. They failed to realize that every time they demanded she sacrifice her own stability for Wyatt's vanity, They were steadily eroding the foundational trust that binds a parent and a child. They were teaching her that her worth was strictly transactional, conditional upon her willingness to be used and erased. It took the intervention of the family's true matriarch, Grandma Inez, to provide the moral correction that Martin and Diane so desperately lacked. Inez's green agricultural ledger is the ultimate symbol of honesty in a world drowning in fiction. It represents the unvarnished truth, the meticulous recording of actions rather than intentions. Inez understood that authentic family responsibility does not mean blindly protecting your bloodline from the law or society. It means holding them to a standard of honor. By opening that ledger in front of the extended family, Inez was not destroying her family. She was attempting to cleanse it. She delivered the harsh, necessary discipline that her son and grandson had evaded for years. Stories like Kara's resonate so deeply because they echo the silent, invisible battles being fought in dining rooms and living rooms across the country. They force us to look at our own family trees and question the narratives we have accepted as truth. If you find yourself nodding along to this reflection of Kara's quiet strength and Inez's unyielding ledger stirs something dormant within your own history, I highly encourage you to follow Jessica Told Stories. We dive into these complex, unvarnished truths every single week, unpacking the messy, beautiful, and sometimes tragic realities of human relationships. Join our community to explore more narratives that challenge the way we view our lives and the people we share them with. As we step back and examine the ashes of the Aguilar family dynamic, we are left with a sobering realization that directly challenges everything we are taught about kinship. Conventional wisdom dictates that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that our ultimate duty is to preserve the family unit at all costs, regardless of the personal toll. We are told that forgiveness is mandatory and that keeping the peace is the highest virtue a child can achieve. But perhaps that is the grandest, most dangerous lie of all. Perhaps the truest act of love and the ultimate expression of family responsibility is not preservation, but demolition. When a family structure is built on a foundation of lies, exploitation, and performative affection, keeping it intact only guarantees that the rot will spread to the next generation. The most profound philosophical truth we can glean from Kara's triumph is that true loyalty sometimes requires you to walk away and let the false walls collapse. It requires the courage to realize that you do not owe your peace of mind to people who use your silence to fund their delusions. We spend our lives terrified of breaking the family apart, without ever stopping to ask if the family was already broken, and if letting it shatter is the only way anyone will ever truly learn how to breathe. Look closely at the people sitting around your own dinner table. Are you holding them together with love, or are you just footing the bill for their illusions?